Okay, so to pick up where we left off on yesterday, um, we were on slide number 5, which is here. So we were talking about the conceptualizations of the stigma process and some of the terminology associated with the modified labeling theory. So, to reiterate, the modified labeling theory is a sociological perspective on the stigma process. According to this theory, an integral part of socialization is the learning of stereotypes, behaviors, objects, and attributes. So, according to this theory, certain stereotypes become personally relevant following confirmation that one possesses a stigmatizing trait, such as the diagnosis or entrance into some kind of treatment program. So, in this case, a person with hearing loss may have grown up with some negative ideas in their mind about what characteristics encompass a person with hearing loss. So now that this person who had kind of developed these negative views over time, now that this person has a hearing loss themselves, now they are experiencing firsthand some of the stigma and the negative character, the negative associations that come with hearing loss. So some of the stereotypes learned earlier in life unexpectedly become applicable to oneself and result in reduced self-esteem. Labeled individuals expect to be devalued and discriminated against and anticipate these outcomes when they enter into social settings. So to avoid negative outcomes, individuals use a variety of strategies, or they might use a variety of strategies, including but not limited to withdrawing from social events, keeping the stigmatizing trait a secret from others, or continuing to conceal it, or even educating others about the reality of the stigmatizing attribute. The modified labeling theory predicts that beliefs about societal attitudes and coping strategies employed enhance the anticipation of stigmatization and lead to negative outcomes, such as restricted social network and negative impacts on work opportunities. Thus, for people who possess a stigmatizing attribute, the stigma process becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So these people have these ideas about certain characteristics in their head. So when they come to acquire that characteristic, they already have an expectation on how they will be perceived and treated. So Link and Phelan in 2001 proposed that stigma has 5 key components. Those key components are labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination, all of which take place in the context of power imbalance. So labeling, the identification of distinguishing characteristics and the assignment of some social significance. So in all societies, each individual has differences based on age, weight, IQ, and what have you. However, many of these differences, like age, weight, and height and IQ, are not stereotyped. So that means there's a process that is in place whereby societies select differences that would be stereotyped. So this governing body that we discussed earlier, they are part of this. They kind of help to decide, oh, what characteristics do we want our quote-unquote ideal person to have? Anyone who does not have those or has the opposite, that is a quote-unquote undesirable person, and they are devalued in our society. So societies categorize and assign labels based on broad criteria. So the person is either young or old, or the person is hearing or deaf. So it seems rather binary, which in computer science and certain organizations and professions that works. But in terms of human beings are not we're not binary by any means. So it's interesting to stereotype them as such. Um, Also, it's important to recognize that labels vary by place and that they are assigned in one society. But because they are assigned in one particular society does not mean that same label has the same weight or relevance in another society. Also, labels will change over time. So, when a given society decides that a trait may be viewed as positive or neutral, uh, at one point early on, it's not uncommon for that positive characteristic to transform over time and now suddenly become something that is seen as negative, or even vice versa. So the labels can change over time. What was once acceptable by society can suddenly be unacceptable by society. So stereotyping refers to negative attributes affixed to an individual or group based on oversimplification or biased time frame of reference. Stereotyping is categorizing or making generalizations about things that we encounter in social settings. And it's interesting to learn why we categorize. It seems that we do it because it's an efficient way to make sense of complex social settings and to conserve cognitive resources. So, in thinking about it in those terms, stereotyping may potentially make sense. Many of the present day stereotypes attributed to people with hearing loss date back to prejudicial attitudes held against people who are deaf in ancient Greek. I think we talked about this a little bit before. We talked about how people with hearing loss or who were deaf were viewed upon as dumb or unintelligent. Yeah, so they were characterized as speechless and most likely senseless, and those types of things. Separation may be created due to dehumanizing and demeaning language, frequently used to reference people with disabilities. Um, So labeling creates an us versus them type of paradigm between those who have stigmatizing traits and those who do not. So although this may not be an overtly expressed goal to separate the two groups, the stigma process results in both people who have a stigmatizing attribute as well as those who do not have one. So we're talking about this insider versus outsider dynamic that we saw earlier in the stigmatization process. Um, so you have those who do not have a stigmatizing attribute, wishing separation from those that do, right? Individuals who have been assigned a label expect to be devalued and discriminated against. Thus, for them, separation results in avoiding mistreatment. So, while those who do not have a stigmatizing trait may separate themselves to avoid stigma by association and avoid the awkwardness of communicating with someone who is stigmatized, for individuals who have stigmatizing traits, separation also means separating themselves from activities in order to avoid certain types of situations that might make them have an emotional response to it. The self-imposed separation was often the result of an expectation that participation in the activity would likely result in acknowledging the trait to others who may or may not have previously been aware. Status loss. So this is another interesting concept to touch on in modeling labeling theory. I'm sorry, modified labeling theory, because it stands to reason that a person with hearing loss might also experience difficulty on their job, and that would also start to impact their ability to do their job and how they are perceived in that particular work environment. So status loss refers to a reduced standing and social position. According to the modified labeling theory, status loss is the result of labeling, stereotyping, and separation. Status loss may arise in any component or dimension of a person's life where a hierarchy exists, like a work setting or even a family setting, you know. People with hearing loss may experience status loss in the workplace. Workers with hearing loss are sometimes denied promotions and or career advancement. In the U.S., in households where one inhabitant had hearing loss, it was estimated that yearly household income was approximately $12,000 lower per year, depending on the severity of the hearing loss. That's quite an interesting fact. So hearing loss can impact your status in your work position, which can also impact the amount of money that you bring home and contribute to your family income. So this idea that hearing loss is all-encompassing further kind of supports the idea that we as audiologists, when we need to treat holistically. We need to treat in such a way that the goal is to improve and enhance certain dimensions of a person's life that are important to them. A person with hearing loss may choose or be encouraged by their employers to apply for disability leave or early retirement from their employment. So a person with hearing loss may even be forced to stop working earlier than they would normally do, if they were a normal hearing person because of this hearing impairment. The stigma process can only take place when there is unfavorable balance of power between the individual who has the trait when compared to others present in the situation who do not have a trait. So an example of a power imbalance would be in the workplace. Like what we just talked about in the previous slide, you'll have a hearing impaired person who is typically the employer, and then a hearing impaired person who is typically the employee, and then that person is governed by people who more than likely will have normal to near normal hearing, and those people unfortunately will influence the work environment of a person with hearing loss, whether it's directly or indirectly. So sometimes the power is on the side of the individual who has a stigmatizing trait, which is good. And in these instances, the favorable imbalance of power may allow the individual who has the trait to deflect or potentially extinguish stigmatizing situations. So the power imbalance can work both ways. The person with hearing loss can yield the power in certain situations, and then in other situations, the power can be held by people who do not have the stigmatizing trait. So labels and stereotypes associated with hearing loss may affect their clients' help-seeking behaviors, as you can imagine, right? If you have a patient who is got concerns about revealing their hearing loss to their friends and family, then it's less likely that they will seek out the assistance of a hearing health professional. So with that being said, the rehabilitation goals should include teaching clients and developing adaptive, effective coping strategies outside of withdrawing and self-isolating, instead of encouraging those types of behaviors. Acknowledging them, yes, because you never want to make a patient feel like what they're feeling doesn't matter. You need to let them talk and acknowledge what it is that they experience and what it is that they have felt because of these experiences. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more about how to do motivational interviewing. But from this conversation and the issues and learning about the issues that a patient is having with the appropriate training and knowledge over time, you guys will be able to ask very specific questions of the patient in order to help build a potential rehabilitation plan or goal. So listening to what their difficulties are and then taking what they're saying and basically restructuring it into a goal, right? And when you do that, you are acknowledging their issue and you are saying to them, I understand that this is something you're experiencing. Here are some things that we might be able to do in order to kind of help reduce some of the difficulties that you're having in your communication situations. Another really big part of being able to do that or training somebody to do that is self-efficacy. So perceived self-efficacy. So intervention programs based on the principles of perceived self-efficacy, or PSE, have been promoted as an approach to the rehabilitation of people with hearing loss. PSE refers to a person's belief in their ability to organize and execute courses of action that are required to manage prospective situations. The aim of PSE-based rehabilitation is to increase participants' levels of PSE using specifically designed approaches, including enactive mastery, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and somatic and emotional states. If the person has high levels of PSE, it is likely that the perceived demands of a relevant situation will not be flagged as something that will exceed their resources. On the other hand, for persons with low levels of PSE, it is likely that perceived demands of a relevant situation will be flagged as exceeding their resources, and a stigma-induced identity threat may potentially result. So PSE level will affect volitional responses, so like your problem focused and emotion focused coping strategies. And PSE will also affect non-volitional responses, so like your arousal and increased blood pressure. So the things that you can't control, like you're sweating, you're breathing hard, like your body's automatic response when it feels like it's under threat, is what I mean by non-volitional responses. All right. So in summary, we talked about a lot in this entire section, even in the last half of the lecture. But we talked a lot about stigma. We discussed, we described the sociological framework of the stigma process and discussed its applications to hearing loss. We discussed the modified labeling theory and how it appears to provide a framework that can be used to understand the manifestation of stigma among people who have hearing loss. We also talked about the model and how it offers a conceptual framework concerning the types of rehabilitative audiologic services that could be provided to people with hearing loss who perceive an identity threat. So that would be the idea of PSE, perceived self-efficacy, that we talked about. That would be something that you might include in your AR program to help the person to be able to basically have more confidence and reliance in themselves. So giving them tools and strategies to be able to anticipate and correct social and communication breakdowns. All right, so that's it for chapter 4. So when we meet tomorrow, we will just launch right into chapters 5 through 8. I will say those chapters are a little bit shorter, so it won't be quite the onslaught that you guys had yesterday. All right, see you then.